Science, the supernatural, biblical prophecy, global events that threaten to rattle the very foundation of human existence. Critical examinations of the most important issues facing today's modern world. Welcome to the Sharpening Report. And now, your host, Josh Peck.
Hello and welcome to the Sharpening Report. I am your host, Josh Peck. Tonight we have a very special first-time guest with us today who co-authored a book with Tom Horn called Redeemed, Unredeemable, When America's Most Notorious Criminals Came Face-to-Face with God. I'd like to welcome Donna Howell to the show. Donna, how are you doing?
Good. Thank you. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time to do this. This is a phenomenal book, and I think something that's important for really every Christian, even if they don't maybe have a particular interest in criminal case studies or anything. But it really, what I appreciate about this book is how it really talks about the things that, you know, we may struggle with, even with forgiveness and, you know, different areas like that. And I think that you and Tom did a fantastic job of bringing that to light in the book. Before we get into that, though, since this is your first time, we have a tradition on the Sharpening Report. All first-time guests give their testimonies. So some in the audience might not be familiar with your background. Could you give us a rundown of your testimony, how you came to know Jesus, and how that led to what you do today?
My testimony is really simple. I was born and raised in a Christian home. I've always respected God, and I've never had any years of backsliding or major falling away from the Lord. I've just always had my faith. I was a pastor's kid for many years, and it's one of those things where a lot of other pastors' children that I knew growing up had been kind of church raised. And so they rebelled against that, and most of them have very good reasons to rebel against that. But they didn't. Sometimes they didn't come back around, and sometimes they did so radically. My story is real simple. I never really fell away from the beginning. I have a very, very commanding. My father has a very commanding presence, and so there was a balance. Actually, this part is relatively important. There was a balance. Every time the church did this, I'd go and, you know, what do I do, Dad? What do I do, Mom? And instead of doing what some ministers have done with their children, where they sit down and they say, well, here's how you've sinned and here's how you can repent. My mom and dad were the kinds that were like, look, that isn't what Christ is about. You know, Christ doesn't care if you have a run in your nylons. And so I had there was a really, really, really healthy balance at home. And so that, I think that's why. But my testimony, it begins at earlier than I can remember, and it remains today. There's not really a central, this is how I came to know the Lord moment. I've always known him, and I've always remained strong in my faith in him.
Fantastic. Well, I mean, and like we were talking about before the show, I know that there are a lot of people that are going to be able to relate to that. And, you know, it is funny because a lot of times when I have guests on and say, you know, we're going to talk about your testimony, they'll say, well, mine's, you know, kind of boring or simple. But those are, when I get feedback for episodes, those are usually the testimonies that I'll get feedback on. So I appreciate you sharing that. This book, Redeemed, Unredeemable, it is truly phenomenal and unique. But for those who might not be familiar with the book or the subject matter, what can readers expect in the book, and what led you and Tom Horn to want to do a book such as this?
Tom was a pastor in one of the world's largest Christian organizations for over 20 years, and he continuously received the question, Tom, what do I do? I'm a sinner, and what I've done is so bad. Christ could never extend his grace all the way to as far as how off the deep end I've gone. And in some of these cases, when they were shared with him very discreetly. He never really interacted with murderers or anything like that. But there were times that he went into the prison and he heard really horrible, horrible things. And so he had to address that question for 20 years in his ministry. How do I convince this man over here that the grace of God will still extend us to him for what he's done? And that question came up so many times that, man, I want to say that he started kind of baking on the idea to write the book 20 years ago. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, and it's been in the back of his mind. And he's watched as certain names have come in and out of history that have left their stamp on the world in horrible ways, such as the 7 criminals who have been documented in this book, and how some of them have come forward and made a public profession of faith in Christ. And he read several of their books. He began with the Susan Atkins book, Child of Satan, Child of God. Susan Atkins, by the way, was she was one of the members of the Manson family who spent her entire life in prison. She was actually sentenced to be executed, but there was this thing that happened in 1972 at the California versus so-and-so, and they ended up just getting life instead. So when that whole thing went down, he got a hold of her book, and he was like, seriously, Susan Atkins? Because we all think that. It's a very human reaction. We see that this person has killed or this person has murdered or whatever, and immediately we think, is this jailhouse religion? I mean, how could they possibly come forward and profess faith in Christ? Yeah. They're so far off the deep end, they don't even know. There's no way. So even before he was a pastor, he was kind of asking questions about that. And then when her book came out, he started baking on this idea of, one of these days, I'd like to, this was way before he was an author even. He thought, I'd like to write a book that says, if there's hope for Susan Atkins, then there can be hope for the worst of sinners. And the idea that there would be one sinner worse than another is actually quite preposterous anyway.
Right.
Because Jesus Christ said, it is not the healthy who need a physician, but the sick. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, let's think about that. Who is the sick? It's not, it's the man with cancer. That has nothing to do with his physical body has nothing to do with, it's relevant as to whether or not his soul's going up or down or left or right. The sick, when I think of who is the sickest of anybody I've ever read about, people like Jeffrey Dahmer come to my mind. That's a sick man.
Yeah.
So let's think about that for a minute. I mean, Jesus Christ said that he came for the sick. I would never want to go, I would never want to go as far as to say that Christ came more for Jeffrey Dahmer than he did someone else.
Right.
That theology is just messed up. But in our regular world, there's this triage. When you go into an emergency room, mm-hmm. You are there because your tennis elbow flared up. This other man wanders in and he's been shot. You were first in line. Who's going to get treatment? Mm-hmm. Who needs treatment? You, hopefully, would be the kind of person to stand up and say, whoa, let me get out of the way. This man's been shot. He needs the physician more than I do.
Yeah.
And that makes sense to you because you don't know this man. You don't know what he's been through. You just, oh my gosh, let me get out of the way and let this man get the help he needs. Why, as Christians, especially as Christians, are we not standing here saying, that man is really sick. Mm-hmm. That man's a murderer or he's a whatever. He needs the physician. Let me get out of the way. Let me stop, hounding him and saying, if Jeffrey Dahmer is going to be in heaven, I don't want to be there. That's something I mentioned to you earlier that I've heard before. When people read this book or they hear of this book, they just automatically think, there's no way these people can be saved. And if the grace of God has extended to them in the same way that it's extended to me, then there's something wrong with this gospel. But
right.
To me, it's like in an emergency room, you are going to see who needs help more than you. And hopefully you're going to step aside and let that person get help. Why, as Christians, wouldn't we extend that same concern to someone else? So getting back to your original question and wrapping that up, Tom, he watched these people make their stamp on the world. Mm-hmm. He watched what they went through, their later public profession of faith in Christ, and he decided, I need to address that question. Christ died for every person. He in the Garden of Gethsemane, and I actually shared this once in an episode of Skywatch with Derek once before. And it kind of came to me in the middle of the interview, and I thought, wow, that's really what this is all about. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Christ did not say, please let this cup pass from me. But if it can't pass from me, here are the people that I'm willing to die for.
Right.
I'm willing to die for the guy who steals cars. I'm willing to die for the girl who insults her neighbor, but I'm not willing to. These people have crossed a line. I mean, it's that he knew in the beginning who he was going to be dying for. He knew who the child molesters were going to be, who the porn addicts were going to be. And he crawled up on that cross anyway. And there isn't a list. It's not limited to what did the physician came for the sick, not for the healthy. He didn't come for the Pharisees and Sadducees. He came for the hopeless. And when I think of who the sick are and who the hopeless are, I think, boy, the 7 names in this book, I need to get out of the way in the emergency room and pray that man gets the help he needs. As a Christian, I shouldn't have any approach to the gospel besides that. So that was why Tom's been brewing on that book for a long time. And when he first came to me and asked if I wanted to work with him to do some of the backup research, that's all I was supposed to be in the beginning, was somebody that kind of helped him put the case files and stuff like that together, and ended up being a lot more involved in the book. By the time the book was finished, he just put my name alongside of his, and we've just been doing it together ever since. But that's the purpose behind the book.
That's amazing, and what a great sentiment to start the show with too, because I think, we as Christians, we forget it's. I think it's easier for, well, maybe some of us, but it's easier for us to forgive a good friend, if he forgets to pay us money back or something, somebody that we know personally. It's way easier to forgive because there's something personally at stake. If I have somebody that I've been friends with for 10 years and he slips up once, it's a lot easier for me to accept that I need to forgive him so we can continue the friendship and I don't have to throw away 10 years of a good friendship. But I think as Christians, sometimes we forget that there are other people that we don't know or have anything to do with that have done way more horrific things that biblically still can accept the gift of salvation and ask for forgiveness from Christ. Like it says in the Bible that his blood's sufficient to cover the sins of the whole world. I mean, that's everything, every horrible thing that has ever or will ever be done. And a lot of times, what I appreciate so much about this book is a lot of times it's kind of a foreign concept or idea that we don't think about day to day. I don't go day to day thinking about forgiving people in the Middle East who are slaughtering Christians or something like that. I disassociate from that unless I catch it on the news or read about it or something like that. But what I like about your book, and well, I should say you and Tom's book, is that it brings this to light, and it kind of puts the reader in a place where they have to think about this, but it's not a bad thing. We should be thinking about this. It doesn't do it in a confrontational way. It does it in the way of, we're Christians. How are we going to accept the fact that that God's forgiveness can be for people like this? And I think that's a really important point, and one that I'm glad that there is a book out there like this. Every chapter in this book, it's basically a case study of various criminals, and I'd love to ask you about a few of them. For example, what can you tell us about, since you brought up Susan Atkins? We can start with her, including the interview that you had with Charles Manson's grandson. What can you tell us about her and her story?
Well, just as a quick early disclaimer.
Sure.
The book does discuss these 7 people.
Mm-hmm.
And this, it may sound like it's another true crime genre book. And even though it does fit into the true crime genre as far as how it's listed in the industry, it actually is not a true crime book in the sense that it doesn't talk about the bloody crime scenes. It doesn't follow the trails of blood out the door and who did what and all it doesn't even get into the gory details. There's a few moments throughout the book where because some of today's modern readers, they might have heard Charles Manson, but they don't really know the story.
Yeah.
So where that is true, we sometimes come around and say, well, here's one or two of the details of what happened, just so that people understand what they have been convicted for. However, it doesn't go into any of the blood and gore. It doesn't. I mean, the squeamish can safely read this book, and some of the content is naturally disturbing just because you have to know what they've done,
right?
And that can get into your head. But as far as the detail, I mean, we leave all of that out.
Yeah.
And I said all of that because I thought, boy, early on, I should probably mention that this is not another crime scene book. Susan Atkins. This applies to all 7 of them, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
But she had a really, really messed up childhood. And she never had a single parent or guardian figure that connected with her. I don't mean that she was never taught the gospel. I mean, she didn't connect in any healthy way to anyone. There's such a disconnect even now in our modern community, even our small community. We see that some children are actually connecting more with Facebook than they are their own parents.
Yeah.
And there is not a healthy camaraderie that will ever bring them out of moments of sadness in a healthy way. Mm-hmm. And they'll find that connection wherever they can. And sometimes when they can't find it from mom and they can't find it from dad, and Facebook is only, well, in Susan Atkins' case, it wasn't Facebook, but from era to era, it's human psychology.
Yeah.
If you don't have any friends and you don't have any parental guardian figures in your life that are connecting to you and saying, oh, honey, you did great, or you're so talented, or you're beautiful, or anything, you're going to find that connection where you can. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times that connection is found going inward. I'm going to be my own best friend because nobody else will be my best friend. She did this. Sean Sellers especially did this. Tex Watson did this. Ted Bundy did that. Every single person in this book, that applies to them.
Wow.
And when she went within to find her own best friend, it becomes a lack of value for human life. And that, in that, why would you care about the people around you? Why would you why would you assign any kind of value to this person? Because you don't even know what value for human life even is. It's never been given to you. This has happened all 7 times. And so in her case, it was Anton LeVay and the Satanic Bible. She became a stripper well below legal age, but she was able to pull it off just because she spoke to the right people and managed to get in there. She was actually cast in Anton LeVay's Topless Witches Sabbath production.
Oh, wow.
And one of those things where towards the end, she was cast as one of these major witch, and she was looking around at the members of the audience and marking her next victims. It was a part that she was playing. Mm-hmm. And from that, something really weird and creepy and eerie happened. And she went back and she was talking to her boyfriend, and he said, there's something very different about you. It's spiritual. It's weird. When you play your harp and you sing, it's like some other voice is coming out of you. In the Christian world, those who subscribe to Christian theology, it's very easy to look at that and go, well, she was possessed.
Right.
But there's a lot of people that would just go, oh, I don't know. She was just acting weird because she got it messed up with Anton LeVay and her head was getting big. Whatever you want to, whatever idea that you want to take from that, she went in completely destructive path because she had no family. Well, then she found a family of her own in this hippie commune place. She ended up getting connected with Charles Manson, who generally everybody understands. Charles Manson's one of the most people out there. Yeah. And he created his own little family. And finally, she had a family. It was a very perverted idea of what family should be. But when he started claiming to be the false Christ and claiming to have all the answers and saying that the world was all about, the blacks versus the whites, and we have to start this whole ridiculous helter-skelter thing, she said, amen, I'm with you, let's go. And it was this big, weird vigilante blacks versus whites with the war. If you read about the helter-skelter war, there's a reason I'm calling it ridiculous, because it's hard to even explain what Charles Manson was even saying. It's hard to even understand the Manson theology behind what he thought was actually going to take place. It's so far off the beaten path. It's insane. But she went into that, and it became whatever it takes. I'm going to have myself a family, and that's almost exactly the same. I mean, everything I've said so far could also apply to Tex Watson. So that's what her story was.
Wow, that's yeah, and it's amazing to think about how these people who've done these horrible things have all had similar types of upbringing, and like you mentioned earlier, what are a lot of parents today doing? You know, when kids are being raised on Facebook and Twitter and things like that. So it makes us wonder what's in store for the next generation. You brought up where are we at? Here we go. Yeah, Charles Tex Watson. Yeah, you mentioned him. What'd you find in his story?
Susan Atkins actually never did kill anybody, and that has been that's been known for a very long time. Tex Watson was actually the knife wielder. He was the one that actually brought the end of life to all of those people. He's admitted that in his book. He's admitted that publicly. He's admitted it at parole hearings. He was the worst of the little crazy Manson pack. And his story is very similar to Susan Atkins. There was a societal disconnect in his life, and he found a family. And he would do anything that man basically told him to do. And by the way, this also applies to Susan Atkins and Tex Watson, as well as several others. There was an actual exposure to the gospel in their childhood.
Oh, wow.
Both of them had been to church, and they had heard about this Christ fellow and the fact that he died for them. But there was never a moment where the gospel came into complete clarity for them. In that, Tex Watson, I believe it's within his book that he explains that when you go to church, you would never go into a church building and see the Sharon Tate crime scene on the wall. On so many levels, that would never happen. But to a child that goes into the church, they see Jesus Christ, blood all over him, head to toe, nails actually piercing through his pieces of his body. And to a child, that's just like, what in the world? I just walked into a church and I'm being exposed to one of the most violent and bloody crime scenes. So Tex Watson just thought it was a crime scene.
Oh,
we don't know why. We go to church and there's a big Roman crime scene. There was nobody ever sat down and said, here's why this is reverently displayed. Here's why his moments of sadness and his moments of blood loss and his moments, all the things going on in these paintings. Here's why this is being reverently displayed in this church. And here's why you need to care. And here's what he's done for you. The imagery of Christ was just a sad and bloody one. And so both Susan Atkins and Tex Watson, for their own reasons, kind of rejected the gospel. After getting totally brainwashed by this Manson clan, he actually and literally goes crazy. He loses his mind and ends up in a psychiatric ward after his arrests for the murder. And when you read through those pages of his memoir, it's very strange because he thinks his hands are glowing in the dark. He thinks that everybody in the prison is plotting against him. I mean, he's lost his mind so completely. And he's in this ward, and there's tubes running up his nose, and machines are beeping, and he's just so alone and so lost at that moment. And yet, the only exposure that he had to Christ, besides a weird bloody crime scene in a church that he doesn't understand, and then Manson claiming to be Christ, it's like, okay, this Christ person it's not real. I don't know what it is. There's again a disconnect. He's in this psych ward, and he starts to feel this presence around him. Now, he can't even explain to this day why he knew this, but when this presence enveloped him in this loving, you're going to be okay, I'm with you type feeling, the first thing that he thought was, this is Christ.
Oh, wow.
But it's hard to explain why he would have thought that and why he would have embraced that. And he can't even explain it because he had been so anti anything Christ for several months after his arrest when he realized, because he did a lot of reflecting and he's thinking, this man who's just claiming to be Christ is he's in a cell block right over there. I mean, that can't be Christ. So he kind of went anti-Christ. And I don't mean like in eschatology anti-Christ. He went anti anything to do with Christ. I don't want to have to do with him. And then when he felt Christ, that what he explains to be Christ in the room with him during that ward, he started just kind of praying openly. And though he didn't know how to pray and he didn't know how to connect with God, but he had heard Psalms 23 so many times that he just started saying Psalms 23 to himself, sometimes audibly, sometimes just quietly in his mind, but he repeated it over and over and over again, and the presence got stronger. But he still came out of that ward, and when he finally was released from that and stationed back in a standard cell for life, it's hard to explain. He met up with a girl he didn't even know in the visitor's room who had come to visit somebody else. And so much of the brainwashing that had gone on during the Manson family thing was, you have to lose the idea that you have any of your own identity anymore. It was actually a lot of that going on at the time that wasn't even related to Manson. Just all these little hippie communes that had established this one with the earth. We're all the same person. We're all the same this. And we're all one with the universe. And when you're all one with everything, then nobody is an individual.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of an anti-individualistic brainwashing idea that after a while of being submerged in that, you're not allowed to be your own person anymore. And the Bible had said that you have to surrender yourself to Christ. And he's like, if it means that I have to surrender my own identity even one more time to follow this Christ person, then I'm not going to do that. But shortly after that, he starts hearing this girl who was in the visitor's room at the prison that he didn't even know. And she's sitting there talking about all of the things that she does for Christ. And it's all a very individual, this is my talent that I use for Christ. This is how I feel about Christ. She was allowed to be an individual, and yet she was still serving this Christ. So it was through joining the idea of surrendering yourself to Christ and realizing that meant he could follow Christ. He just had to surrender his talents for Christ's purpose where he was at, which in his case was prison. And that he was still allowed to be Tex Watson, whoever that was at this point, because he didn't even know who he was anymore. It was, oh my gosh, the psychology of the Manson family and everybody involved in the Manson family. It's a phenomenon unlike any other, period. I mean, unlike any other story, unlike any other group of people. It was in all sense and purposes the most unbelievably hard cult to understand in my reading. And so that's what Tex Watson went through. And when he came out on the other side of that, he radically dedicated himself to Christ. He's been following him ever since, and he has several prison ministries. And Susan Atkins did too prior to her passing.
Oh wow, it's amazing to hear about these stories and how, like, what people have done and how they came through it, and what they're doing now, or what they before they passed, or whatever. It does kind of give us hope that if some of the and of course we're not trying to judge anyone's heart, or we're not trying to determine who's saved and who's really saved, because we don't know, but it at least gives us hope that there is hope for people who have done these horrible things. You mentioned Sean Sellers as well. Who is he, and what's his story?
Sean Sellers was he was one of those teens that kind of got involved in the Dungeons and Dragons, like the self role play identity crisis that happened during the Satanic Panic. He actually went on later in his own book to admit on that there's this assumption that people make that any kid that is involved in Dungeons and Dragons is gonna become demon possessed and want to kill people. And he said, no, Dungeons and Dragons didn't make me do what I did. But he was heavily involved again with Anton LeVay's Satanic Bible.
Wow.
He did not have a friend in the world. He was abused by his parents. He was abused by other people I'm not allowed to name. We actually were able to get into contact with several very, we were actually able to get in contact with several very high profile people during the writing of this book.
Oh, wow.
As an example, and they all agreed to work with us. As an example, Carmen, the musician, really, really popular like the 80s and 90s for some of his, Christian rap and all that. Carmen agreed to work with us on the book. Mm-hmm. And we had a certain level of communication going on with him. Unfortunately, we weren't able to nail down his final interview for the book just because he was in chemotherapy at the time, because he's battling cancer. But he was Sean Sellers' personal pastor, personal mentor on death row.
Oh, wow.
Just prior to Sean's execution. In fact, he was in the room with Sean Sellers when Sean Sellers was executed. He was seated 8 feet away. He agreed to work with us and tell us his side of the story. We also got testimony from Dorothy Ottnow Lewis. She is a famous psychiatrist who she worked with Ted Bundy as well, by the way. Mm. But she was involved in some incredibly high-profile murder cases, and she has come forward and said he legitimately had multiple personality disorder.
Wow.
At the time that he was incarcerated. Now, if you have ever done, well, now it's referred to as dissociative disorder, but if you've ever actually looked that up and did any research on how a person develops that, it's not a born with that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. It's one of those moments where you kind of have to wonder, would a monster like Sean Sellers be made, or was he born?
Right.
I'm one of those people that says he was made. Mm-hmm. Because I believe that every person's born into this world as innocently as the next.
Yeah.
He was abused. He was abused by certain people in our family. The information in that area coming from Dorothy Ottnow Lewis, who told us some really sensitive case information that couldn't be found anywhere else. And in her personal disclosure, she said, yeah, there were some really horrible things that happened to him that we can't talk about, but they were so bad. I mean, he would go into a place in his mind while some of these events were happening and talk to whatever voices he could find. And as many multiple personality disorder cases back in the day, well, and now, have proven, when you go into your own mind and you start developing different personalities that you can talk to escape something that's happening to you, that turns into what Christians would refer to a lot of cases as demon possession, what doctors refer to as some kind of a mental illness, and it goes on and on. But it doesn't matter how you want to look at it. What it involves is that you don't have any external friends. You don't even know how to communicate. If somebody came along and said, wow, you're hurting and I really want to reach out to you and be your friend, you don't even know how to talk to that person.
Yeah.
Because your only connections are going on up in here. And that was what was going on with it. It's a very, very famous case of multiple personality disorder. He murdered his parents with a gun in the middle of the night, and he murdered a gentleman at a convenience store down the road. So it wasn't like a killing spree. It certainly wasn't the bloodbath that the Manson family that we had just spoken about had been capable of. But what he did was horrible. And a lot of people, it's one of those cases that some people get hung up on because you think, well, some of these other people in the book murdered other people that they didn't know. Mm-hmm. It's different to look at your own parents and think that you could be capable of that. Well, he was capable of that, but not because Sean Sellers was fully in control up here. He mm-hmm. was capable of that because Sean Sellers wasn't even there anymore. I personally, not saying that this is what the book says, because the book never says clearly one way or the other what our opinions are and whether or not this person was really saved, or we never say that. We just present the evidence and let everybody else draw their own conclusions. But it is my personal opinion that he was demon possessed. Mm-hmm. And one of the voices in his head was named Ezurate. And Ezurate came and relieved him of very, very horrible moments, like he would just escape and go to a different place and come back later. And Ezurate had taken over his body and helped him get past that.
Wow.
That's also a multiple personality thing. Medicine has its approach. Religion has its approach. I have my approach. But, whether or not Sean, as Sean Sellers, knew what he was doing when he was carrying out those murders or not is one of those things that it's one of those things that was brought up so many times after he had been found guilty in a very quick trial, by the way. Trial was like a week long. Everybody had their opinion. They said he did it. Let's get him. And they put him on death row and scheduled up an execution. That case has been since then referred to as the most bungled court case ever, because there were paper trails of evidence suggesting that he was not within his right mind and that he should not be tried as an adult because, by the way, he was underage when he committed the murders.
Oh, wow.
He was the youngest person in the state of Oklahoma ever in history to be sentenced to death. Now, he wasn't executed until he was, I think, 29. But he was, at the time that he was sentenced, he was the youngest man ever in the history of Oklahoma to be sentenced. So you look at that, and that's basically his case. He was out of his mind. He was lonely. He was abused. There was never a moment where he was going to connect with anybody in a normal way. And again, when you don't connect with people, parents, friends, whatever, if you don't ever make that connection, then you're going to find it where you can.
Yeah.
And in his case, it was Ezurate. Whether you want to believe that was a friend that lived in his head or a demon, whatever you want to say. I will say, though, that he did have a long history of satanic prayers. He had virtually memorized huge, long sections of the Satanic Bible. He had performed rituals that purposefully invited Satan to come in inside him and live within him. So I think if you are a conservative Christian, there's no doubt in your mind that he had something living in there that shouldn't be.
Yeah, sounds like it to me, and that brings up an interesting point too about a lot of times when these things happen, it's really easy for us to watch the news when this stuff happens and just assume, well, that person needs to die and they can go to hell, but they might not always be in control of what they're doing, and does that mean that they're not to be forgiven? Was there any evidence of any type of redemption from him, or did he eventually, before he was executed, did he come to Christ, or was there any evidence of that?
Yeah, actually, I don't know why I didn't mention that. He wrote Web of Darkness, which at the time was his case was so controversial that it was an instant bestseller and kind of got out everywhere. He also started a Radical Teens for Christ. It was a ministry he ran from prison. What happened was a couple days after he was arrested, he woke up in prison claiming, I'm not saying this is really what was the truth, but he woke up claiming, how did I get here? Where am I?
Wow.
They said, you've been arrested. You killed your parents. And he's like, no, I didn't. So to whatever degree that may have been the truth, and if you read everything that he's been through, I personally believe that it was true. It would stand to reason that it would be true. Then right after that, he's like, okay, well, here I am. I'm in prison. Ezurate has left me. That was interesting.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? You'd think that whoever that thing was, that's part of the reason why I personally believe it to be such a strong case for the authenticity of it being a demon possession case, because had it have been a friend that lived in his head and just multiple personality disorder and that's all it was, that would have been when that friend would have came back, strongfold.
Yeah.
That would have been when it really would have kicked in and said, hey man, you're lonelier than you've ever been. I'll be your friend. But it didn't. It left him. And perhaps if you want to look at it as possession, that might have been why he left him, because the demon saw, well, I've done all there is to do and this kid's en route for execution, and whatever, I'm going to go over there and possess that guy or whatever.
Yeah.
So Sean, he didn't immediately just get down on his knees and pray, but he started thinking and purging, all of the Satanic Bible and the what have I done? There's something that happens in prison that nobody, unless you've been there, can really describe. I can't even describe it. I've never even been to jail or been arrested or anything. But there's something that happens, and you get there, and the way they have all described it is that they have that I am a man undone moment.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in that moment where, and by the way, I'm not talking about light prisons. I'm not talking about, this man is wanted for auto theft and he gets caught and they put him in a light prison, but he's allowed to go outside for 3 or 4 hours a day. I'm talking about the confinement of your cell in a high security prison. We're talking life or death row. When you get there, you're lucky if the prison system allows you outside of your cell for 1 hour a day.
Yeah.
And it's within those walls, and it's within that seclusion that, number one, you don't have access to what tempted you before. You can't get out there and kill people or whatever it is that you were so tempted to do before. You don't have access to it, so that's gone. There isn't anybody, and there never was for these 7 people. There never was anybody anyway. So now you're still alone. Look what your trail of blood has done for you. Aren't you? Are you done? You've done the worst that you can do, and you're here. You're stuck, and all they can do in that moment is sit there and reflect and say, "Boy, the lives I've hurt." And it's within that moment that the identity of some of the people that they've hurt is important to them. It's actually after all of the death and the horror that they have caused that suddenly the identity of the people they have hurt matter. It's at that moment when the value of life that should have been instilled when they were a toddler and never was suddenly comes to them, because I am a man undone. And so it's at that moment that remorse finally kicks in a way that it never did before. And that's what happens with Sean Sellers. That could apply to any of the 7. But when Ezra Wright was gone, Sean Sellers basically got his hands on a Bible. Can't even say. I get choked up when I think about prison ministries, because I can't. I could say a lot about people who managed to get the Bible into the hands of the prisoners. But anyway, he gets his hands on the Bible. And again, Psalm 23, that one comes back over and over from story to story. Here he is. He's walking through the valley of the shadow of death, and it is really bad. And he finally says, okay, look, I've done this before, and it ended me in a bad place. I gave my life to an entity before, and look at where it got me. On the one hand, I'm kind of scared to dedicate myself to anything. But on the other hand, I need something, and I need radical change. And so he fell on his knees before the Lord and asked him for forgiveness. And he felt this washing presence come in and remove all of the voices or the friends or whatever medical demonic possession, whatever you want to put it. They all went away, and he was a completely different person. He started keeping a journal in prison that went out to was published and went out in a million different directions. Radical Teens for Christ was his thing. So yeah, he started a ministry. They have since then fizzled. Mm-hmm. And I'm not really sure why, to be honest. They had a really cool infrastructure, so I'm not sure why his ministries eventually fizzled, but they did. But Web of Darkness is his book, and it's still out in circulation.
Wow, that's amazing and absolutely fascinating that somebody that has gone through all that can still, be redeemed. Another really interesting case. And this is one that's probably going to be familiar to most, and actually the next 2 or 3 are probably going to be. But you have the son of Sam, David Berkowitz. What can you tell him about him and his whole journey through life and to possible redemption?
The son of Sam was David Berkowitz. He was also known as the 44 caliber killer. Mm-hmm. And he was kind of terrorizing the cities of New York. Now, this is a very, very, very interesting case because he has been put in prison for a certain number of murders. To this day, he admits to some, but not all of them. Mm. And when we contacted the people that we contacted the perpetrators themselves, those who were still living, and we also contacted people who were related to the victims. And we contacted, like I said, in the case of, Carmen, who was the mentor for Sean Sellers, and Dorothy Otnell Lewis. Everybody we contacted said, oh yeah, I'm on board with this project because A, you're not going to go down the trail of blood yet again, and B, whether I am a Christian or not, and in Dorothy Otnell Lewis's case and a couple of these other names, they don't profess to Christianity. They like the idea that there would be at least one unbiased piece of writing out there that doesn't directly declare one way or the other, but represents the idea that it's possible that these people would have had a redemptive quality, whether that redemptive quality be for like it is for Christians where it's Christ, or just because, like Dorothy Lewis, who wants to just believe that these people still matter. David Berkowitz's reply, I mean, we wrote him a lot of times, and you know what? First of all, they've fallen off radar. Both Tex Watson and David Berkowitz have fallen off the radar intentionally. They will write a person a letter, and what they thought that they were ministering to somebody, across the states. A few weeks later, that letter shows up on eBay, touched by the killer type of a letter. There are serial killer fan sites online. So they caught wind a long time ago that this was happening, and they've basically said, we're done. We're not talking to anybody outside of the prison. Our ministries are in here. Well, he was one of he said the same thing. I'm done. I'm not working with anybody. You can contact me all day for an interview. I'm not agreeing to nothing. Leave me alone. And for a very good reason. That is the way that both of those men were. After sending them a letter, and they actually getting the information about what we were planning to do, which is, no, we're not going to say you are saved. We are going to tell your story, and then we're going to let you speak for yourself in an interview that follows the chapter. Mm-hmm. They both immediately agreed. David, he was really nervous. When he read what we had written about him, and by the way, we never glorified him. It's not pretty. We did not make him look like a saint. We told the world how bad he really was. Mm-hmm. He starts telling us really early on, no, I never killed that person. I know I'm in prison for doing it, but that's not somebody that I killed. Whoa. Seriously? So we actually did a whole bunch of research, and we took that one. That one is one case where we talked a little bit more about the case than the person, only because that is such a big claim.
Yeah.
That I'm in prison for killing this number of people, but really these are the only ones that I should be guilty for, and it doesn't make it any better or worse. It's mucks next to whether or not he should be there. He should be there. He knows that he should be there. He's not trying to get parole. And it's a quick side note. Mm-hmm. He has been up for parole several times. He has also sent a cease and desist letter to the parole board several times. So for those of you, for those people who are saying, oh, well, yeah, he is trying to get parole because I see it. His name comes up every couple of years to try to get parole. Actually, that's not true. He has already tried to get out of the parole hearings. He doesn't even want to be there, but it's one of those things where he keeps on showing up because he's supposed to show up because it's his own parole hearing, but then he'll write a letter and say, look, I'm not trying to get parole. Please leave me alone.
Wow.
So there's some clarification for you there on that one. But the idea that he would come up and say these things, it was so amazing. We actually did quite a bit of research behind the case. We believe, Tom and I believe, that he is not as guilty of the other murders that he is claiming that he never did because of the evidence, not because, hey, we're buddies with David Berkowitz, but because of the evidence, and the evidence is strong. Mm-hmm. And that's all there in the book. But he terrorized New York. He was involved in a satanic cult. Once again, I mean, that just keeps on coming back over and over and over again. He had read the Satanic Bible by Anton LeVay.
Wow.
And he was involved in a satanic cult. There were several of them that were all committing crimes together. And some of the names, I got to be careful because some of those names I'm not really supposed to be talking about that he has told us. But his interview's in the book, and you can kind of see where his story went from there. Son of Sam killer, and the 44 caliber killer, also the bulldog killer because he used the bulldog pistol. He terrified people to the point that because his victims up until a certain point were all long-haired brunettes, all the girls were cropping their hair and dyeing them blonde, and they were scared to death to go out at night, and people kept getting shot. So he was a pretty big name. So after he had been arrested and incarcerated, and by the way, the Son of Sam moniker, while he was terrorizing the state of New York, he was sending letters to the police written by the Son of Sam. And that's why he's known as the Son of Sam, because he wrote these letters that was just baiting them and terrorizing them letter from the killer, leaving them on the grounds at the crime scenes and stuff like that.
Oh, wow.
So that's why he's known as the son of Sam. Well, Sam is actually a play off Samhain, Sam Hain, spelled Sam Hain, pronounced Samhain. And so he just truncated it, and it's the son of Sam now. He went on to explain to people immediately after he was incarcerated, I don't care about these people. I just shot him. Well, why do I care about her? She doesn't mean anything to me. Samhain, or by this time he was even pronouncing it Samhain, because after the people discovered what Sam was short for, then everybody started saying Samhain. He knows how to pronounce it, but by this time he was saying Samhain. But Sam told me to do it. Sam told me to do it. I don't care about these people. Sam told me to do it. And so, as it turns out, he admitted later that Sam was a black dog from his neighbor's house that was crawling out of his doghouse and telling him to go kill people. All of that was all a lie. And he admitted that it was a lie. He's like, no, Sam never told me to do anything. This was all just a big lie. But he went with this story because he was trying to protect the other people that were involved in this little circle that to this day, I mean, every one of them that was involved with him have come to very, very, very peculiar and bloody end. But he radically turned his life around. He got into and got his hands on a Bible. There's that part of the story again. He got his hands on the Bible in prison and he started praying. And yet again, Psalm 23. He started praying it over and over and over again, feeling like a man undone. And I don't mean to sound repetitive. I don't mean to wash them all up in the same story and say they all basically had the same come to Christ moment. They didn't. They're distinctly different every single time. With Sellers, with Sean Sellers, you had that moment where Ezurate left. With Susan Atkins, you have that moment where she finally connects with somebody that's not. It's different for every single person. But it's amazing, isn't it, that the gospel is the same for every single person.
Yeah.
However they find it, that the truth of it is the same, and it's universal. So yeah. Actually, he has been on 2 or 3 different DVDs now, Christian interview DVDs that are relatively popular. He's written several books. He still to this day keeps up with an online journal. He doesn't have internet access, but he'll type a journal from a typewriter and send it to a friend of his, and he runs his website for him. He owns several ministries now in prison, and he is a prison chaplain. So he's very active in the prison now.
Wow, that's fascinating. What can you tell us about Karla Faye Tucker, the Pickaxe killer?
Karla Faye Tucker, her case is interesting in that she never set out to kill anybody. She actually, being a murderer was never a part of the deal for her. She got involved in a really bad crowd. Her mother was a prostitute and would pass her Johns down to her and basically trained up her child in the ways of prostitution. And so her mom, her sister, and herself, Karla and her sister and her mom, the 3 of them ran a prostitution business together. Their house was just a crash pad. They had wild parties all the time. They had this boyfriend of the day club going on, new guys all the time. And so she, as well, never really developed a healthy connection with anybody. Her connection with society was, how much am I worth to you for a Saturday night? And so she was suffering that same disconnect, but it manifested itself in this anger towards this other person who had just gotten under her skin over and over and over again. So she sets out with this big plan. Her and her boyfriend are going to go over to this man's house in the middle of the night and steal his motorcycle. And that was the plan. Nobody was supposed to die. They had been on, I'm talking a cocktail of drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Woo! Like later on, I don't remember what the exact quote was, but later on after the drugs that she and her boyfriend had both taken had been analyzed and considered by a psychiatric professional. They said anybody on that amount of drugs would have been out of their mind. I'm not surprised.
Wow.
So they were both on this huge cocktail of drugs. They went to this man's house and he caught him stealing the motorcycle. By the way, yes, the motorcycle was in the living room. I know that's a weird part of the story, but he kept his motorcycle in the living room because he probably had friends and the wrong places and knew that somebody was going to kipe it if he didn't. But anyway, he kept his motorcycle in the living room, and they went in and they were trying to get, disassemble the bike and get it out of the house or whatever. He wakes up, and Karla's boyfriend goes into the back room and just starts wailing on this guy. He finds a peen hammer, and he just starts wailing on him. The next part of the story is really disturbing. So just to get straight to the point, the sound he was making after this man had beat him within an inch of his life was so guttural and so horrible that Karla went in there and found a pickaxe, because the man worked with a pickaxe every day. That he broke up ground, and he was in construction and various other things that he did. She found the pickaxe next to his bed, and she finished the job. Neither of them saw that while this was going on, there was another woman in the room off on the other side of the bed who had heard them, rolled onto the other side of the bed and hidden herself kind of under the bed, sort of. And when they found her, they thought, oh, snap. Well, this guy's dead, and it was a mess. And it was all just started by Karla's boyfriend. I'm not saying she's not guilty, but she just got caught up in this thing. And so they decided that they were going to kill Deborah Thornton, too, which was the lady who was in the room. Now, Deborah Thornton's brother, Ron Carlson, I had to think of his last name for a second. Ron Carlson was also one of the people who spoke with us. Mm-hmm. And when Karla Faye Tucker, she went in, actually, it was a branch of Teen Challenge that originally made the difference for her. She thought she was stealing a Bible after she'd been arrested and she was put in this prison. She thought she was stealing this Bible, but as it turns out, they were there for the prisoners to take. But she gets it and she shoves it under her shirt, and she flies back to her room, and she's sitting there reading through the scriptures like, oh, is there any hope for me? And she gets into a conversation and finds out through this woman, the Teen Challenge group that was there ministering at that prison, they were doing like puppet shows and stuff, things that you wouldn't normally think would happen in a prison where there's a bunch of adult women who are all rough. But it was there was so much levity. There was such a lifting presence there, because everybody was giggling about what the puppets were doing. It wasn't another conversation where you're going to sit down at the table and learn who did what and who killed who. So it ministered so much to her. She grabbed this Bible, she runs to the back, and she starts pouring into the scriptures after hearing the sermon from the lady from Teen Challenge, who had been through not everything that Karla had been through, but her life was very much the same: prostitution and drugs. And so she follows through with the studying of the scripture, and all of a sudden, simultaneously in another part of the world, Ron Carlson is sitting there, who his dad was murdered with a shotgun, like 2 years prior to losing his sister, who was the woman hiding in the room that Karla and her boyfriend ended with a pickaxe. And he went and got on his knees in the middle of a joint. Okay, he's sitting there, as he said, there I am smoking a doobie and reading the Word of God. That was his quote, not mine. He gets on his knees mid-joint and just starts praying.
Wow.
Saying, I don't get what. My dad was murdered, then my sister was murdered, and I don't understand why you're letting all of this happen to me, if you're even there. But this is nuts. And he feels kind of his own little upper room moment, but he feels the power and the presence of God washing over him. And all of a sudden, he feels this voice, not an audible one, but just this sense voice telling him that he has to forgive Karla. Mm. The other one, the young man that murdered his father, I believe, was already passed away by this time. But he heard that the Lord saying that you need to forgive Karla. And so, I'm not going to forgive Karla. Are you nuts? I want to kill her. Actually, he wanted to kill her. He wanted her not to be in prison because he wanted to get revenge. He was very close to his sister. His sister was kind of a motherly figure to him. So he goes and he finds out what prison she's in, and he walks in, and she doesn't even know who her visitor even is. Not on the visitors list, just this guy shows up. And she doesn't know who he is. And he tells her, I just wanted to tell you that I am Deborah Thornton's little brother, and I have come to tell you that I forgive you. And that is it. And she starts crying, and the prison guards think that he's upsetting her, so they start to intervene, and she tells him to hold off. There's this big union between the two. And she is so sorry for what she's done, and he's so forgiven her. And that was such a cool testimony, because can you imagine that moment being Karla Faye Tucker, where you're in prison and all of a sudden this guy shows up who wasn't on your visitors list. You don't know who he is. And he says, by the way, I'm the little brother of the person you're behind bars for killing. And I just wanted to let you know, no strings attached, I forgive you.
Wow.
Their bond and their friendship was immediately so strong that he continued to visit her up until her execution day. On the day of her execution, when somebody is executed in the prison, they have the viewing rooms. Mm-hmm. And the people who are on the victim's family are over here, and the people who are related to the perpetrator are over here. Mm-hmm. He, instead of sitting in the room that was for the family members of the victim, he went and sat as if he was her sister, as if he was her brother.
Oh, wow.
He sat in the room holding the relations of Karla Faye Tucker. And she got married while she was in prison to a minister, and between those different relations that she had created during that time, a lot of prison ministries were started through her name, and they continue to this day. And that's one that's very difficult for me to get through without choking up, because it's just the Ron Carlson and Karla Faye Tucker thing was so unbelievable and amazing, and yet it really did happen, because you have the testimony from the horse's mouth. You have Ron Carlson coming on with us and saying, I hated her. I wanted to kill her. And then I just forgave her because through the power of God, I was able to. And that's funny, because when you think about that for a minute. At the beginning of the show, we had talked about how we as Christians should be engaging in the triage of the emergency room. We should be the ones saying, this man he needs the physician the most. Mm-hmm. And instead, we're saying, oh, look at this Jeffrey Dahmer individual who's really sick over here. Get him out of here. He's creeping us out. It'd be the equivalent in our finite overview here. It'd be the equivalent of if you were, you and your flared up tennis elbow was in the emergency room right now, and a man came in shot, and you were like, oh, get him out of here. He's bleeding all over everything.
Yeah.
And you know what I mean? I mean, how shallow?
Yeah.
How shallow do you have to be to extend that kind of an attitude for somebody who is in more need of a physician than you are any given day of the week? Ron Carlson, through his forgiving and developing a close friendship with Karla Faye Tucker, extended the triage. He extended the she's in more of a need of a physician than I am, and I'm going to forgive her, and I'm just going to love her because that's what I feel that Christ is telling me to do. If the little brother of the man the little brother of the woman who was like a mother to him, who was killed with a pickaxe through the heart, is able to come forward and say, Karla Faye Tucker needs a savior, and I'm going to be her friend. How much more so should you and I, whose our greatest enemy is our greatest enemy because they're mowing the lawn on Saturday, wakes us up at 7, or you know what I mean? I mean, how we live in this petty little safety box, especially us in America. We want to garble and complain all day long about politics and how we are losing our freedoms and America is losing its sovereignty and what's going to happen to our currency. And we want to get into all this blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, we are living in a very good country, and it's still the greatest country. And we're so isolated, it's not the word, protected by this little box that we live in. It's just so easy, isn't it, to look at people who are really in need of a savior and say, get them out of here. They're going to bleed on me.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. And it's so amazing how God can take a situation as horrible as these and turn it into something like this. And it's a sobering thought. What can you tell us about Ted Bundy?
Ted Bundy, he's one that gets pretty hard to talk about. His chapter was very hard to talk about as well, just because he's so famously known for the most horrendous crimes, that it's difficult to talk about him without going into real deep, disturbing stuff. But he was a serial killer and one of the worst. And he killed